Wine is, at its core, a product of nature, and as such, it is heavily influenced by all of those natural factors that inevitably will vary season by season and year to year. This is what is commonly referred to as vintage variations, and it explains why we might happen to find that a wine coming from the same vineyard can be very different from one vintage to the next. I'm Jacqueline of Vero, and today we will look closely at what variables can cause vintage variations and the beauty in embracing these variations instead of fearing them. Every aspect of a wine is strongly affected by vintage variations. This can be taste, aroma, and even color. There are many factors that can influence not only these characteristics, but also the overall quality of a wine year to year, and most of them depend on weather and are beyond human control. Sure, a winemaker can tweak their winemaking style a little from year to year, but human intervention, especially in the cellar, can only go so far without major meddling, and we will talk about that later. But at the end of the day, the first and most important thing to a winemaker is always going to be Mother Nature. And especially as we've seen this year, she likes to improvise. And she can get even really creative in some seasons. To synthesize the bare bones of what is a very complex issue, we can say that there are three main factors that influence the maturation of the grapes and that can vary year by year. These are warmth, light, and humidity. A great vintage happens when there is an almost perfect balance between the intensity of warmth and light, a perfect level of humidity. And it's no surprise why these perfect conditions are such a rare thing. Light. Like any other crop, vines need sunlight for photosynthesis, the biological process that converts light energy into chemical energy to fuel a plant's activities. A longer growing season that starts early in the spring with lots of hot sunlight when temperatures are not yet too high translates in better yields and higher quality wines. On the contrary, shorter growing seasons with particularly long and cloudy, rainy periods slow the growth of the plants. This prevents optimal maturation of the grape berries. And the early awakening of the vines is, while a welcome sign, it can also increase the risk of spring frosts, which is one of the most dreaded seasonal phenomena of winemakers. Warmth. Constant weather with constant temperatures throughout the entire growing season is a producer's dream, as the extremes in both high and low temperatures are not ideal. Especially hot weather leads to high sugar at the expense of acidity, giving overall jammy flavors and excessively high alcohol levels in the wine, sometimes making it even difficult for the wine to start or finish fermentation. On the other hand, particularly cool years will have the opposite effect, with grapes that are rich in acidity but lacking in sugar, and they will go through a shorter fermentation, which leads to wines with too low of alcohol and a weaker structure. On the other hand, particularly cool years will have the opposite effect, with grapes rich in acidity but lacking in sugars that will go through a shorter fermentation, which leads to wines with too low alcohol and a weak structure. Humidity and water. Rain is an essential aspect to any agricultural product, and wine is no different, especially in the parts of the world where irrigation is not an option. Rain fosters the vegetative growth of the vines and thus can lead to bigger yields. But here, the key is timing and intensity of the rain that really makes a huge difference in the final outcome of a vintage. Rains during the growing cycle of the vines can allow beneficial growth, although too much rain leads to the spreading of detrimental molds and fungal diseases. On the other side, towards the end of the season, when the grapes are ripe and almost ready to be plucked, rain is dreaded by winemakers as it causes the berries to swell and the flavor, aroma, and color compounds to dilute. This leads to wines with less intense aromas and less concentrated flavors. In general, an overly rainy year increases the volume of the grapes at the expense of the concentration of the fruit flavors, giving a high quantity but diluted wine. Also, storms like floods and hail are extremely disruptive events that will give a smaller yield, if not completely destroy a harvest. With these many variables that are beyond the control of the winemaker, it is no wonder that a wine can really be different from one year to the next. But when faced correctly, these variations can really tell the story of the season, making every vintage special and kind of like a little signature of Mother Nature. But since a winemaker can add up to 200 ingredients to a wine and not disclose it on the label, sometimes these year-to-year natural variations can be muted or disappear entirely. Big and industrial winemakers are typically more concerned with maintaining a steady level of quality and a consistent flavor profile of their wines from year to year. That's why most of the big wineries would heavily intervene with the aforementioned chemicals in the cellar to fix the signs of vintage variation. This is not the case, however, for small wineries that strive for quality. They cherish vintage variations and they work with nature rather than against it, limiting their intervention in the cellar. That's why it's important to get to know the producers and the way they work. But how to find these small producers? That is what we at Vero are here for. We work only with small producers that respect nature and try to minimize their interventions in the vineyard and the cellar. Take a look at our online shop and browse these small production wines to experience vintage variations yourself. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe, because in some upcoming videos, we are going to do some vertical tastings and talk firsthand with producers about how vintage variations translate into their wines and into your glass. Bye!